We are responsible for our waste. How do we value this? It's really hard in a linear economy to start valuing things going back around. If it's achievable, then I think it's more likely to happen.
Welcome to the second Renaissance, where we decode the rebirth of human creativity in a technology-driven world. In this second season, we explore how sustainability is elevating our human consciousness and catalyzing us to create within constraints. We decipher why now is the biggest entrepreneurial opportunity since the dawn of industrialization, and what leaders can do to harness the winds of change. I'm Sorman-Nilsson, global futurist, impact champion, and father, and your host for the second Renaissance. Today, I'm excited to be bringing you Lisa Mclean, the CEO of New South Wales Circular. Lisa is a circular economy and zero carbon business transformation leader. She's been successfully advising industry and governments in developing new policy frameworks and regulations that bring about market change to enable the circular zero carbon economy over the past 14 years. Lisa established and led the Open Cities Alliance, a peak industry association with unique membership from government to private sector and research organisations. Open Cities advocates for the circular economy, prosumer rights, and new local utility and mobility precinct approaches. Her sustainability thinking regularly features in the ABC, in the Australian Financial Review, and in the Sydney Morning Herald. Lisa helps us define the circular economy and its innovation capacity in this conversation, and highlights why circularity's time has come in a massive way, the ticking climate clock, and what we can do individually and systemically to shift from a linear economy to a circular one. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome to the second Renaissance, Lisa.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely honoured to be here talking circular with you.
I feel like it's very much, and tell me if my feeling is wrong, but I feel like it's in the zeitgeist at the moment that everyone's talking about the shift from the linear economy, easy to say if you're Swedish, from the linear economy to the circular economy at the moment. Your time has come, it seems.
Yeah, look, it's good and it's about time. And I think there's a real reason why that's happened. COVID has certainly accentuated this because it's changed our supply chains. It's meant that all the things that we used to be able to take and get, not all of them were available, and we had to think about new ways of doing things. But the circular economy is actually the only economic framework we have for us to grow our economy, grow jobs and investment into the future in a resource-constrained future and a carbon-constrained future. So it's really kind of the only option in the bag at the moment. And the World Economic Forum helped to set up the World Circular Economy Forum with Citra, which is a Finland investment fund, to raise awareness about circular economy, because we need to start thinking about other ways in which we can get all the things we need while at the same time not depleting our regenerative systems and not contaminating and polluting our planet.
So, I mean, circular sounds wonderful, and people talk about the linear model of being take, make, waste. It's fairly easy to understand, but before we move into what the future of circular economy is kind of headed, just give us some definitions or some really good, examples of, what the world used to look like and what's not okay, and just how, a product or a service could go circular instead, for example.
Yeah, look, it's a really good point. I think the concepts of circular economy need to be explained. Ultimately, it's decoupling economic growth from virgin resource use. So that means, how do we keep making things we need without taking away from the environment at rates that are unsustainable? So we're going to have 10 billion people on the planet by 2050, and we actually do not have enough resources to continue to consume the way we are. So it's pretty serious stuff, Anders, and it's time that we had this big discussion about it. And people will have heard about going beyond our planetary boundaries, living for 2 or 3 planets. That's precisely the rate in which we're consuming at the moment. And the real problem is not our needs, because we can get our needs met. It's what we're doing with all this stuff that we're making, and the true costs of making it aren't borne out in the price tag. So, for example, single-use plastics, for example, these things don't have a future life. They go into landfill along with a lot of other things. I mean, there's so many components that currently go to landfill. And some of these things can be extracted out of landfill and have got really big value on them. So we think about solar panels. Solar panels have got silver and silicon in them. Other electronic waste have got precious metals in them. And again, a lot of this is either incinerated or going to landfill. So it's kind of a no-brainer that we have to change our supply chains and change the way we manage waste to be extracting that value. And there's lots of ways we can do that. We can reduce the waste in the beginning when we're designing packaging. And that's why you hear about the R's, reduce, reuse, redesign. But we can also recycle things. We can share things. The other thing that we can do is refuse things. We can start saying, actually, no, I don't need to buy that because I can get shared mobility, to your point about it as a service options. I can get a car as shared mobility instead of buying one. Or I might be able to get fashion as a service. There's a good one that's coming, and I think that's very appealing to people. People's ears tend to pick up around that because that means, we can get a subscription to our winter or seasonal fashion, and we get really good quality garments that then when we're finished with them, they go back to be repaired, and then they're creating jobs in the process, and out they go again to new customers. So lots of ways in which we can rethink this circular economy and what it means. So it's right across our economy. I'll just finish by saying that it's not just about waste management. So we will have heard about circular economy in terms of recycling stuff, but circular economy is way deeper. And that's why we're starting to think about recycled water in utilities. We're starting to think about transport that's sharing and reuse business models. So it is right across the economy. It's what we call a systems transition, and it requires a lot of change, and it requires all of us getting involved.
Yeah, and I think some great examples there. What I'm also thinking there is just to smarten it down, even to sort of a personal, financial management of our household, right? And if I think about your example of, we're living as if we actually had 2 or 3 planets, and the smartened down version of that is in your household. Imagine if you're spending 2 or 3 times what you were making, right, a year on credit cards. At some stage, the tax man or the credit card company is going to the debt comes back. And I guess this is comes back to the definition of sustainability, right, which is meeting today's consumers and today's humans' demands and desires without jeopardizing those of future generations, right?
Yep. It's absolutely right. And I just think that no one likes throwing food scraps in the bin with bathroom and hair and clothes, and it's actually disgusting. And no one really wants those outcomes. We want to be able to say, actually, you know what? These garments, some of them are at their end of their use, but they're to be worn, but they could be used for other things, for rags or cleaning or whatever. Some clothes could go to be reused, and I've got these other items that could be actually have that value extracted from it. So I think people are crying out for those types of services at home. And, we know that with food waste, for example, we can get a compost and a worm farm, and that's something that, it can be a generational thing. So I think there's some barriers for younger generations who mightn't have that connection with country or the environment to learn how to use them, or they might be in apartments and there's less space. But technology in the market's starting to provide us with different solutions, bins that we can use in the home that break it down, that we can use smaller scale for plants, for example, and you can scale it up if you've got a bigger garden, bigger waste streams there. So there's certainly things we can do for organic waste that perhaps are a good way to start to see circular economy and how it can be expanded through into other parts of our lives. But, we've got a big role to play. We're all consumers, so we can use our purchasing power to rethink about things. Do we actually need to own it? As I was saying before, could it be a service that we could take those items from? Could we borrow something, go to a tools library, for example, or even go to our neighbour and borrow a drill instead of buying a new one? So thinking about, these types of options. And then, we also have a role to play in our own jobs, because where we're working, we're thinking about how we procure things and buy things in the office, how we get to the office. Can we use more public transport? do we need as much paper in the office? Can we just be paperless and save on waste that way? What about food if we're organising an event in our office for our team? Can we make sure that we order less to start with, because there's always a lot left over? And you know what? We could all do with eating a little bit less anyway. It wouldn't matter if we went home a bit hungry. And, are we utilising services like Oz Harvest and other services that potentially can take, local services that can take that food and give it to someone who really needs it at the end of it? So once you start to go on this circular journey, Anders, as you would be, have experienced yourself, there's so many endless opportunities for us to all contribute and do better.
Yeah, and I think about the small and the big changes we can make, right? This is, at home we've got 3 worm farms. We've got a sub pod that I'm sure you've come across, which is a subterranean compost that sits squarely in the middle of our vegetable garden, which I've had huge amounts of fun building with my 4-year-old son. And this sub pod is phenomenal. So unlike the worm farms that we also have, which are above ground, it actually regulates the temperature so that the worms are happier. And of course, they feed on our scraps. And over the course of 6 months, or over the course of a year, I should say, this sub pod, just by taking all of our food waste, which we try and keep to a minimum, that offsets the equivalent of 6 months worth of motor vehicle carbon emissions, which is pretty amazing when you just think about the fact that you're essentially just burying your food into a little hole in the garden, right, and letting the worms do the sequestering of carbon, etc.
Absolutely. And look, our organic food waste represents 3% of our national carbon emissions. So it can be up to 40% of the red bin waste. So big opportunity there. And look, the other really key thing, which I haven't talked about yet, too eager to get to it, Anders, but you're talking about carbon reduction. So circular economy has a critical role that's kind of been a bit secret, really, in reducing carbon, because to get to 100% of our carbon reductions for the Paris targets, we've got to look at renewable energy and energy efficiency, and that's probably only going to get us to about 55% of the carbon emissions we need to make. The remaining 45% will come from, it's embedded in products, in agriculture, in food systems, the way we use and the way we dispose of food and products. So circular economy has a critical role to play there to reducing those other sort of embedded emissions, hidden emissions. That's for almost half the emissions we need to cut. So I think that's quite an empowering story, because it's not just reducing carbon when we're taking a circular economy approach. It's one of these few economic frameworks that does a lot more than that. It's helping to restore biodiversity. It's helping to create regenerative systems and alternatives. So if you're making all this compost, guess what? You don't need to buy chemical fertilizers. And I think that's a very important opportunity. There's a cost saving there, obviously, as well. But then, we have too much chemicals in our environment at the moment. We do still need fertilizers, obviously. They're important. But at the moment, getting that balance right has been a struggle. And if we can actually replace chemical fertilizers with natural fertilizers, we've got a really big opportunity of rejuvenating our land. And, the depletion of our lands at scale is also another bespoke problem for Australia, a really big one. This is carbon emissions can be reduced by our consumption.
Yeah, this is why I've taught my 4-year-old son to always wee in the garden. So just something from my Swedish childhood that lives on cross-generationally here in Australia as well. So you've talked a little bit about, the circular economy, what we can do in the home, the fact that even, our food waste is a big emitter of carbon or methane, is it, or carbon once it goes into landfill?
Well,
checking the chemistry here.
Yeah, it's got a much higher ratio. It's almost 3 point something more potent than carbon. So that's sort of what happens to it. Yeah.
So I read a fascinating example just recently about Sam Elsom from, I think it's called a sea forest here in Australia, that are feeding a particular type of seaweed now to cattle, so that essentially they fart less. So apologies for lowering the intellectual rigor of the conversation here. But they can feed it to even sheep. So now MJ Bale, which is an Australian fashion brand, are using this seaweed to feed their farmers' sheep, which has reduced the methane emissions by something like 87%. So it's actually, driving a new type of product that's way more environmentally friendly. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're able to even pass on some of those costs, because I feel like now, sustainability and premium or even luxury brands really go hand in hand. What's your sense of what I term the conscious consumer now wants?
Look, I think you're absolutely right. I think that what people are always looking for is quality, but often the price point has prevented people from getting that. And so that's where, if we look at fashion, which is a massive issue for waste, so textile waste is an issue because often complex fibres woven together, really hard to get the cotton out of what's majority plastic or synthetics in there. So textiles is a big problem. And in the past, people would be perhaps looking for quality garments. And we've seen, your H&Ms and other brands come in, Zara's and other brands, which had really great style, could do it more affordably. And people felt that they could actually get access to that quality, paying less. But the problem is the longevity of these garments. And we're seeing fashion as a service, for example, in China and in Europe. It's a really multi-million-dollar business growing really fast, because, you can invest in a really good quality garment that's suddenly also affordable to you because you're taking it as a service. Sure, the longer you want to use that for, probably the more it's going to cost you, but you've got the option of using it when you need it and getting it when and giving it back into the economy for when you don't. So I think that circular economy isn't saying that we need to settle for less. And I certainly don't think it's saying, we've got to wear secondhand clothes from now on. That's absolutely not the case. And look, circular economy businesses are often highly profitable because they've got multiple revenue streams. They're often, instead of paying to get rid of a waste, they can get paid to keep that waste and turn it into something else or design it out from the beginning. So if we think about washing machines and dryers, and I've got a dishwasher downstairs that cost me a lot of money. It's not very old. The engine's blown up. Someone comes out. There's a service fee for about $180. And guess what? It's going to cost over $1,000 to fix that machine. Now, but I'm told that if I buy another one on the spot or in the next couple of weeks, I will get my service fee paid back to me and I'll get a new machine. And it's just not satisfying for people. And we also know that the cost and the value inside that machine is significant to the manufacturer. So Philips, for example, and this is a global program that's just going to start in Australia hopefully soon, where you can actually get your white goods as a service, so that at the end of the day, that service person will come and take that back and say, tomorrow we will bring you a new one and it will cost you the same because you're on a service fee arrangement. And guess what? The company if it's Philips in this case or whoever, then gets that really valuable kit back home because pretty much all of it's new. And if you Google these parts, or looking up to pay, to fix those parts, and I did in this case, the components were about $150. So it's the expertise to fit it out that costs money and other things, and the price points, the market's not there for it. But you can see how the company can actually make big savings by doing that in-house and by then keeping those products back in the market. So I think there's a piece here around actually the circular economy will better tend to people's expectations and needs. And we know that this is part of the past. I mean, it's not back to the future, but we do know that the value of on products and materials was much higher in past generations, and we had a skill set in a workforce that was capable of being agile and repairing and fixing those sorts of things. So there's big opportunities for new jobs, for new industries to build around this as we actually start to reduce waste and improve quality for people.
I find it really heartening, and it's really satisfying that the right to repair movement is really gaining some speed, but also when you have a great experience of something being repaired. I'm not the most practical handyman ever, but my 4-year-old son somehow thinks that I can fix anything. And he, if he's in doubt, he just goes, just use some sticky tape. He's got some challenges saying sticky tape. But, so I'm not the best person to repair stuff, but I do manage to do it. And I insist that things that we've paid, good money for should be able to be repaired either by us or a skilled professional. And so we had an experience recently with, to your point about white goods or things that go in your home, where the new house that we moved into came with a fridge. And this particular brand, which was Samsung, had some issues with a freezer compartment. So we sort of ignored it for a while. We were like, we'll live without crushed ice coming out of a little container for a little while. But it started leaking and there were some issues. But Samsung was super helpful. They sent out someone to help repair, diagnose very, very quickly within 48 hours, even despite some lockdown challenges and all the rest. And managed to replace parts, repair it, and it's as good as new now. And I was really impressed with the service up until the point where they said, what do you want to do with the old parts? Because, I've been spoilt with the likes of, Apple, for example, where I get to take back my old iPhone and exchange it essentially for a new, and know that the cobalt, the lithium and the gold, etc., in my iPhone will be recycled, upcycled, etc. Samsung went, we can take these away from your house. And I was like, oh, that'd be nice. And I'm assuming you'll, disassemble these things and then turn them into, a new part. And they said, no, they will go into landfill. This is all my Twitter feed, so it's all public information. What do you think? What do you think? What do you make of that?
Look, I think it's tough, and I think businesses, there's a lot of change happening. We're at the forefront of quite a lot of change, and it's just not going to be acceptable moving forward to do that. And eventually we'll look back and think, can you believe that we just threw it in the bin? And I think there's a big piece here around product stewardship, Anders, which is, we're seeing those regulations coming in. With China Sword, it was a fantastic thing to happen, in my opinion, that we are responsible for our waste. And so the federal government's been moving really quickly to invest in product stewardship schemes. And what that means is that if you make it, you're responsible for it. And, it's your value too. It's your dollars invested in those broken pieces or those parts that still have some value in them. And so setting up systems where companies can actually take back their own waste is what we're going to be seeing more of, and I think what people expect. And if it's not that same company, new industries will start to emerge to get that, and they might form partnerships with your Samsungs and others to get that, extract that value back. But this is precisely the grit of sort of where we work at New South Wales Circular around supply chains. And there's 3 areas we work in. One is around building credibility around the economics of circular economy. And so we have appointed Australia's first chief circular economist. And she has been very busy. Dr. Kame Tang has been very busy spotlighting these opportunities, where if we had all of that electronic waste and could extract value from it, what's its worth? What is that worth? Where's it going at the moment? We're looking at solar panels. We're looking at construction materials and other things. So that's a really important part for us to start to understand, how do we value this? It's really hard in a linear economy to start valuing things going back around. And so lots of work has to be done around that. And that's something that we're really committed to, so that our regulators understand and reward sharing and reuse rather than sort of flush away and throw away business models, which quite frankly have been here for 75 to 100 years. Let's face it, this has been the business as usual for a long time.
Yeah.
So the economics is one thing. The second area we're working in is around supply chain. So how would we help these companies, the example you've given, to actually create a new supply chain for their waste stream? And recently we did a fantastic project with St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, where a very passionate nurse, Rodrigo, was really sick of all the plastic waste. And he simply created new systems internally with that hospital to capture the needle caps and ampules and clean stream them into certain bins. and ensure that it was safe and ensure that, they were collecting as much as they could. So he did that, and then we partnered with St Vincent's to introduce to them a manufacturer in Orange who was using virgin oil to make his components for his different market. And he came to the city, he picked up the plastic, the PP and PE plastic, and he used it to make components for wind farms, and he used it to make roller door wheels for the built environment. So, and suddenly he's able to grow his business and look at potentially putting on, 10 FTE positions, new positions in his business. So supply chain is super important, and people need help with it, Anders, to your point. They're not going to be able to do it necessarily on their own, but what we do want to start seeing is that people accept the reality that this is waste, that this is costing their business. And once we all can do that, and if we're either working in a business, having the foresight to question that, if we're running a business, don't be afraid to look at those streams. And at the moment, yes, you're paying for that to be out of sight, out of mind, but wouldn't it be wonderful if those old pallets that you used for vegetables or whatever else at scale could go to a pallet bank? Because, maybe the market needs 1,000 of them and you've only got 10. So you go into a bank together, and locally you work together to do that. So we're seeing a lot of those types of businesses emerging to fix that sort of supply chain issue.
So in that regard, I find myself sometimes meeting a bit of resistance as a futurist. We're kind of like science fiction authors in a sense, or science fiction authors for business. And so we're always selling, this is what the world might look like, dystopia and utopia in 2025 or 2030, 2050. And we try and weave a new strategy, a new narrative to get people's hearts and minds along on that journey, co-designed with our clients. And sometimes I come up against this resistance, which is that people go, it's fine if Woolworths or Coles want to use their buyer power to say, hey, if you want to come along on the journey, if you want your goods on our shelves, then X, Y, Z are the expectations. But what about, smaller brands, SMEs? What kind of influence could they have, and how would they go about exercising that power? I'll give you an example, right? So my wife is a fashion designer, fashion manufacturer, and they're doing a lot in terms of sustainability, where they're sourcing their lycra, etc., for swimwear and all the rest, largely from recycled plastics, ocean waste, etc. And they're doing a lot of work in packaging and producing locally with factories that actually meet Australian labour standards, etc. So there's a good sustainability story there. But there are sometimes challenges working with suppliers around the world and kind of going, well, we're a business of this size. How do we influence those suppliers, those factories, those producers to come on the journey with you? Or is it just a matter of switching whole scale to only working with B Corps?
Look, I think everybody's got to do what they can do in their business, and if it's achievable, then I think it's more likely to happen. So, and there's lots of different profiles of businesses from large scale down to small, and I think a couple of really important things to think about here are, for example, we import so many plastic pellets. It's just ridiculous. We could actually produce and be an exporter, a world exporter, with the amount of plastic that we've got going through. So there's an opportunity immediately for anyone in that manufacturing space to be trying to replace. Don't import it. Look for some Australian solutions. And that's a really important theme, especially with COVID happening. We've seen some broken supply chains, and the geopolitics is changing some of those supply chains. So looking locally is a really important piece of this. What can I do locally? Yes, my business might be national, but what can I be doing locally to reduce transport costs, packaging costs, and all these different things? And I'm thinking of companies like BVN, who've got some BVN's an architectural firm. They branched out because they were very passionate about the circular economy and designed a new form of venting system for the built environment. And what they do is they use recycled plastic. They have a 3D printing machine that can be taken to a construction site And instead of using steel, and those big heavy steel vents that, sort of push out air, in one spot through a grid, they've created this plastic that they can print out of their machine on site, 2 specs. It's biomimicry, so it breathes. It's got holes all through it, so the air flows, consistent. And they've come up with this fantastic new solution that was actually, it's not their core business to be doing that, but they've created this because it was a problem to be solved. And as a sustainable company focusing on sustainability, they looked at the venting system, which the design has stayed the same for centuries, and the amount of steel it uses. So huge carbon savings, huge environmental benefits from that, and transport costs. And they've come up with a solution that takes their product into a site, and they produce it on site without those transport costs. So I think ingenuity, thinking out of the box, is really important. Ultimately, we can only do what we can do, and giving it a go is very important. And I would encourage people, particularly small businesses or medium-sized businesses, to be looking locally. Once you go on this journey, and my colleagues, research colleagues talk about this all the time. I'm thinking of Niall Blair from Charles Sturt University, the former minister, Honourable Niall Blair, was saying just the other day that once your eyes are open to this, you start to see lots of opportunities. And then also you're going to be investing and supporting in those solutions, and with it will come local jobs and cost savings will come.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, what are the most heartening stories where you've either seen a large behemoth, big incumbent multinational making strides, or a small to medium sized enterprise really finding opportunity and turning them into benefits to people, planet, and ultimately profits as well?
Well, look, I've given some examples already with your Philips, with your washing machines, and BVN's another example, although they're still in incubation phase. But there's so many fantastic examples. We actually have sponsored the Circle Awards, which I'd encourage you and your listeners to have a look at. The Circle Awards has got these fantastic new businesses. A lot of them are disruptive, smaller scale businesses with solutions that are circular. I think about shared mobility. It's a really, really big part of the circular economy. If you think that a car costs about $8,000 a year to own and run, to have a shared mobility as a service or a membership, and if you're using it quite a lot, you probably pay around $2,000. You're looking at $6,000 savings already for the year. It might be for your second car, or could replace a car that you're planning to buy, especially if you've got public transport near you. So shared mobility is a big example, and you've got your Go-Get and your car next door and those types of solutions that are really important. And we have examples. I've given you some examples in the hospital sector. There's lots of examples where companies are really being brave in terms of changing their packaging, and the packaging covenant. APCO's another example of some really phenomenal design for products, and some of them are really simple, Anders. They're not complicated. So, how we get the little bit of tomato sauce, for example, we get it with our pies and squirt it out. Yeah. Why can't we just use the tomato sauce at the shop? And if you want the tomato sauce, they'll put some in there. Those tiny plastic things just need to get out of our economy. So some things, no matter how carefully we design them, we actually need to refuse them. They need to be designed out of our economy altogether. Yeah. That's some examples around that. And that, I think that point's really interesting, because I have met a little bit of resistance at times when people kind of go, oh yeah, green, sustainability, sure, we've got a pandemic now, people have got more important things to think about. It's been the contrary in my experience, and certainly the data shows that the consumer has become more conscious through the pandemic, not less conscious. But there was a moment when everyone was like, oh, Anders, clean is the new green. We're wearing disposable masks. We're throwing alcohol on our hands all of the time. People are not able to sit down for a coffee in a cafe. So, we can't compromise safety. That's a really important piece in all of this. And I think that there's so many other ways in which we can still be sustainable. Like, we just have to make sure that the things we're making these components out of can go back into the economy over and over again. And we've got the systems to recycle those things that we can't design out at the moment. And certainly safety is so important with COVID, and we would never be suggesting that we'd compromise that. But, you know, it would be good if our masks and things could then go back into, be recycled in a way, or be, you know, used longer. And I'm sure that companies are starting to look at that. But just to finish off, think, you know, our discussion a second ago too about, you know, businesses, it is a big challenge too for a lot of these linear companies, and they're faced with challenges that are, you know, will cause them to lose, you know, they're losing a lot of money already because they know that their products are carbon intensive, for example, or they know that the products they're producing won't have a future, and they've got to start rethinking. And so there's a really important piece here around innovation and how we bring research together with these businesses to solve their problems. And I think in waste management, there's companies that I know of that have, you know, just, you know, a decade and a half ago would have had world-leading solutions to deal with red bin garbage, for example. And now, you know, turning it into organics or other things. And now we're starting to see restrictions and regulations preventing those solutions from moving forward, because we know so much more about what's going into the red bin now. We know that there's PFAS and really toxic things, PVC, that are in the bin that we're using in our homes that go in the red bin and then actually can't be mixed up to go back in the environment. So we need to know about this too. Like, what are those things that are really toxic that we shouldn't have and we shouldn't be buying in the first place? And I kind of think it's a little bit like the 80s and 90s where we started to get awareness around nutrition and what was actually on the back of the pack. If you look at the back of the pack of products, it's really hard to know what those things are. And I think starting to get greater awareness and building more regulation around this and build more understanding around this is just really important. Like, so consumers can make more informed decisions, and they know that PVC is actually toxic and there's alternatives for them that they can get.
Yeah. I mean, I think about some of these business models as well, whether it's, you know, Loop from TerraCycle, launched at the World Economic Forum. TerraCycle here in Australia is already active with Gillette, and they're going to be collaborating with Woolworths. But, you know, even my razor blades now, TerraCycle will take them back, a little bit similarly to, you know, Nespresso pods that are now being recycled and taken back. I think we'll see that across all categories. I mean, I'm finding it a little bit hard to stand and sharpen my razor blades. I don't have the technology at home to do that. But, you know, I'm glad to see that companies like Gillette and Woolworths, Tesco's over in the UK are now starting to use, you know, very old school business models. There's almost sort of the milkman business model. And Loop in Europe, for example, you know, they're sending out like a tote bag and you know, the containers can still be branded depending on your, you know, your favorite goods, but, you know, eventually they go back to the dark store or wherever it happens to be and get refilled. And again, you know, it makes so much sense. And I think there's this anger amongst the consumers that there is just so much waste. I think of nappies now that we have a 3-week-old at home, and while we buy organic and even the plastic bags that we put those in are biodynamic and will break down, I'm going, we're supposedly not meant to put those into our compost, and so I'm like, where does that go? Someone's got to be able to design a better system. And I know, back in the day, you sent your cotton nappies away to get cleaned by someone else, poor person, who had to clean all of those. But Give me a solution here for the nappy problem.
There's G Diapers actually. Well, it's not in Australia yet, but G Diapers is an Australian guy and his American partner who created this same thing. They had babies like you had, were sick of the waste. They were living in Portland and created G Diapers, which is now in France. It's in the States and a few other countries. It's not in Australia yet. But I think those solutions will start coming. And to your point, even if it's sort of a rough and ready solution to get going, I think that eventually these companies start to get more and more sophisticated. So then they're going to be thinking, right, well, how do we actually get more value out of these complaints? How can we create a proper collection to get back from the consumer what they've used, because that's worth something to us, and we're not going to be able to produce these things for the same price because our natural resources are getting so depleted now. The cost is just going to start to increase. So, I think it's going to be an interesting observation to see how companies tackle this. And good on the companies for trying new things. I think that's really important. But there's no doubt that carbon emissions are really attached to this. So it's not just enough for us to cut carbon. We've got to reduce waste, and they're very, very connected. There's carbon emissions in the manufacturing and the use and the disposal of those products anyway. But how are we thinking about, bringing that all together in a way that reduces transport costs too, because transporting is obviously costly. So that's where being your local community and this local element is quite powerful in circular economy, and thinking about how that sort of decentralized piece plays out. And we're seeing that with recycled water, even in utilities. How do we enable people to get free energy from the sun, to recycle their water, to keep their organic waste locally, even if it's not in their own home, but locally, to enhance biodiversity and soil quality and so forth? How do we reduce vehicle use because it's, we forget that cars actually cause a lot of health problems in communities. I mean, we're talking stroke, heart attacks, health issues caused by pollution, and that affects our children too. And I think in Sydney, for example, my son was in childcare before COVID, the years before COVID, and childcare would be closed every couple of months, and they wouldn't let the kids outside because the air quality was so poor. So we were starting to see that happen. We've had a bit of a reprieve with COVID, and we haven't seen those pollution levels spiking. So I think that these are big, important issues for us to be discussing. It's just not enough to say, oh, well, cars are causing cancer and other things. That's fine. It's not fine. And that's why the transition to electric vehicles is just so important. And, there's a lot of things we've got to think about here. And also with COP happening, people probably hearing chatter about it, but it's also, we are in a global world now. What we do in our backyard matters. Even if our government or even if our jurisdiction doesn't care about it, it does matter, and it has global implications. So, the world's moving really quickly towards measuring carbon and, creating a carbon economy. So it's something that we've really got to start thinking about with our own actions.
And I think, the notion of true cost, as you've alluded to before, we're just not paying the true cost of, the disposable straw, for example, or, if we go down to the $2 shop, without pointing finger at the $2 shop, what's the true cost? Who had to sit through potentially, really, abusive, labor relationships in a distant part of the world? Was there child labor that produced, a toy for an Australian kid? These questions, while they sound, super privileged, they're real concerns. And when we don't pay the true cost of something, it's an unequal playing field. We're going to be interviewing John Elkington, the author of Green Swans, in a few weeks' time on this show. And he's very much of the opinion, and it draws the analogy to big tobacco and what's happening at the moment. And he says, tobacco had to contend with this idea that you had to put, the health implications on the pack, together with, now generic packaging, but also, what are the long-term external realities or externalities of smoking. And he says the same should be true if you're a manufacturer, or if you're a food manufacturer, a food producer, and you're using certain types of fertilizers or have other negative externalities. You need to put that on the package. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, Anders. I think that is such a good analogy. And imagine what it would look like. Straws and you think about the water pollution, what it's doing to our animals. So we've got, extinction rates in Australia are higher than any other country in the world. Poisons that we put out don't just kill the rats that we want to kill, they kill the eagles and the other animals that feed off them, or the owls. There's big implication. Chemicals we use because we just happened to buy it. We didn't really know that we thought it was a weed killer that, that just can cause cancer, but can also stays in the environment for a long time, killing bees and other really important parts of our biodiversity. So we need to have that awareness and responsibility. So there's a piece there around, we've talked about product stewardship, but it's so important for each of us to take on these questions. And if you don't know, put it out to you on your socials and ask someone, and pretty quickly someone will come back to you. I mean, I notice at the school, the kids all need to get glasses for a Christmas event, and someone's volunteered to go to the $2 shop to buy a whole lot of them. And, that's great. But at the same time, there's a bin up the road which just happened to have a whole lot of glasses in them that from a previous concert that just happened. So it's just linking this together, and it's not quite there as a market yet. So it's no one's fault. It's just that we have to start looking for further and deeper for what are those opportunities. And then organisations like New South Wales Circular are just getting really busy at trying to build those connections and those supply chains. And one of the really interesting projects we're doing is our citizens work. We have a citizens task force that we'll be launching soon. And some of that work is around how we can create local community hubs for circular economy. And we're starting to see that. You may have some where you live nearby. Here we can go and we can take more than just batteries back and paint tins back. We can take back coat hangers and soft toys and textiles and other things. So, building the network of people to come to those places. How do you do it? That's the secret magic, right? How do we get people to be going there or going to a repair bar to get the toaster fixed or the jug fixed when they typically just chuck it and buy another one? So, I think there's some really interesting research that'll come out of there, and some more models that we can start emulating on how to, really connect with people and show them that pathway, because it'll be just as quick or just as long as buying a new thing. You just got to find that pathway.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that in terms of what we discard, and maybe as, a family grows, you grow out of certain clothes, maybe it's, little, baby toys or whatever it happens to be. I know Lego now, which is one of our clients, they're starting to ensure that you can actually donate your Lego back, and they give it to kids who might not be able to afford, Lego toys, for example. And so there are all these, wonderful circular recycling types of initiatives. We also thought about, because we moved house recently, we thought, okay, well, let's deck it out with a new couch. And then we thought, actually, let's not do the new couch. Let's go up to Nicole's dad up in the Hunter Valley, who's got one in his shed that Nicole grew up with back in the early 80s. And, it's been through a massive flood, and so it was not in good shape. By doing that, not only do we get a repair person who's really good and skilled, an artisan, an opportunity to practice his skills in terms of refurbishing this couch, but also using sustainable materials to put on it, and hopefully we've just given it another 20 or 30 years life instead of it ending up either being burnt or being put into landfill, and one less couch had to be produced. I know that's very micro scale, but it surprises me that not more people think in this way. And I think this is the point around neighbourhoods, and I want to come back to this. We've talked a lot about business today, but I'm curious in terms of your Open Cities initiative, etc., what's happening on a New South Wales basis, regional basis, smart cities basis that you find really inspiring at the moment, or what do we need to do more of?
Yeah, look, I think it's so important, and that I was talking about our little program before, which is going to be really exciting to get going. But how do we actually? Council might build these facilities, so repair or create space for repair and reuse businesses, and they might create a place where you can take back stuff as well, drop off place. But how do we actually get out there and tell people about it? And I think, Gumtree, Facebook have got very interesting opportunities here to get really involved. And Facebook, has had a surge in its marketplace. I don't know how often you use it, but it is phenomenal. And I think I used it quite a lot through COVID, and obviously before then, and lots of people have. And it's just great. You get to meet local people, particularly during lockdown, because you couldn't travel a certain distance. So it was particularly appealing for people in your really close neighbourhood. And it's astounding how many people are just there waiting, looking for that right thing. So marketplaces like that are going to be more and more important. And I think that, you know, councils do have a big role to play here with some services and leadership, you know, showing people what's possible, making space available. And space has been a very costly and difficult piece pre-COVID. And ironically now, you know, commercial space is very available and very affordable. And, you know, councils and governments are really looking to utilise those spaces because, you know, we're working from home more, travelling less. And what people have seen since COVID is that actually they're even more productive when their team's working from home largely. In some cases, that's not always right. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, we're always going to all work from home, but certainly we've seen a big surge in the percentage of staffers working from home now. So office space is different. People are wanting boardrooms instead of you know, desks. So as people are working more from home, you know, that's the flip side of it. They're in their local community and they're going to be needing more things than they did need before. They might have got their shoes fixed. They might have got or bought new things in the city or wherever their place of work is. So it's been a very interesting journey to be working with councils as they sort of adapt to those changing needs of people within their community. And I think also people are more aware of their natural environment and way more appreciative of their natural environment because they're looking for reprieve from, you know, working in their house all day if they're remote. And so this connection between waste and biodiversity is really big. I mean, around here, you know, people were walking along different waterways. You know, we've been picking up waste out of that waterways for years and years. We always pick it up as we go. And now there's a whole movement of people picking up that waste because there's so many more people have the time to go at lunchtime down because they're working from home to do that. So people are really connecting with their communities and potentially seeing that negative impact of waste streams, both water in the waterways and also in land. So I think it's all connected, and I do think that it's got to be both demand driven and it has to also be that councils are providing new services and they're allowing space for new businesses to be working here. And that can be hard because councils might have arrangements with big waste management companies to get rid of all the waste. And actually there's lots of value to break it up. So there's a lot of complexities here that they're working through.
Yeah. You talked about COP and COP26, which, you know, as we record this, is sort of in full motion or coming towards the end. What's your sort of analysis of what's happened? Any news stories that we should be paying attention to? What's been inspiring or disappointing about the meeting in Glasgow?
Look, from our perspective, there's a piece around circular economy and those embedded and hidden emissions because there's been so much talk about renewable energy and the energy transition, which is absolutely critical, and obviously the transport transition to EVs. It's got to happen, and the market is going to make this happen regardless of recalcitrant governments. The market's there. We've got a lot of leadership here in New South Wales, and I think that the federal framework around product stewardship is really exciting and inspiring as a result of China's sword. So I feel like the framework is coming together, and I think that there is no moving away from the future. You know, you talked about the future. We're constantly in transition, and as we move constantly in transition, we're moving further and further away from carbon-intensive economies. And the circular economy is actually a really exciting, positive narrative for all governments to get behind. It's great for consumers because it means we can finally buy things that we don't have to chuck away, and they might last longer, and we'll probably get them cheaper too. There's opportunities, as I talked about, shared mobility, even recycled water, getting energy from the sun. There's lots of opportunities to have downward pressure on costs for people. And for businesses, there's an opportunity to make more money, which is great. And in boardrooms, circular economy is a way in which they can tackle way more carbon emissions than they thought they could, because they'd already sorted out their energy and transport. Well, suddenly there's a whole new chapter here for them to dive in to cut carbon. And it's also a way in which they can get competitive advantage by designing new products. And so big opportunities, I think, around there. And I do believe circular economy has got a very special role to play in Australia, especially with a very carbon-intensive economy. And, the different political landscape. I do think that circular economy is a narrative that could go really far out of Canberra by looking at these additional carbon emissions we can cut through recycling. And it's also about innovation, how we can catalyse new solutions.
So it's always interesting whether, Scott Morrison is holding up a lump of coal or an iPhone upside down in interviews, but as he did recently. And he says, technology will solve all of this. And, it's almost sounding like back to Malcolm Turnbull's Innovation Nation and, the jobs of the future. People get a little bit kind of going, how's technology going to shift all of this? I mean, I'm a tech utopian to a degree, but what would you like to say there?
Yeah,
what types of technologies and, how will they help us exactly?
The technologies are just not going to appear. We need proper frameworks and targets. We can never get anywhere if we don't have a target or a compass. So the first thing that has to happen, and this is how it happened when we started the zero carbon transition, we need to be able to measure it, we need to be able to set targets to it, and then we all need to work together to exceed those targets. So we absolutely need a plan and a detailed plan around that. Technology is important, but it's not going to cut it at the moment because we have very sophisticated markets that are, as I mentioned before, that our regulators promote and support linear business models that have been in place for the business models are 75 to 100 years old. We've got lots of innovation happening, but they can't scale because they can't compete against the current market structures and these particularly a lot of monopoly type providers that we have in different markets. So there needs to be market reform. I think that the approach that's happening in New South Wales is very inspiring around this and other states where they're starting to map out those bespoke opportunities. Also, I like the fact that states are working together because they can't do it on their own. The cost of the infrastructure transition means that one state alone can't necessarily make that step. So I'm talking particularly around circular economy. Like what's that infrastructure we need to, whether it's to create recycle batteries, to extract lithium or what other things we're going to be doing. How do we actually afford to build that kit and infrastructure? And it's something that we've got to share right across the state. So I think that it's all great to say innovation, and we're a huge supporter of that at New South Wales Circular. We are funded by the Office of Chief Scientist and Engineer. But what makes our platform really unique is that we're a collaborative platform. We need industry in there, and we also need researchers, and we also need government. It cannot happen on its own. We've got to move forward with those things together.
Cool. I'm curious, where can people find out more? If people want to engage with Lisa and Circular New South Wales Circular, and, truly make their businesses, their communities, their home lives more sustainable, where do people tune in with your work? And
check out our website. We'd love to have you visit us. We know that we are partners with Planet Ark, and around Australia there's a few organisations working in this space. I'd encourage everybody to look at the Circle Awards. They had their first inaugural event this year, but there's some fantastic businesses in there and products that you could access straight away. And also just go on your own journey. You need to start exploring and say, what is this circular economy? How can I be part of it? How can I get what I need and get rid of what I've got in a sustainable way that's going to add value? So go on your journey, and then you can report back to us and tell us how you went.
Yeah, fantastic. And my sense is that the climate clock is very much ticking, and that talking about 2050 or like the Chinese and India, 2070, 2080 is far too far into the future. I believe that we've got
2030, Anders. That's what we're focusing on for the future for our kids and those generations.
Yeah, great minds think alike sometime, and certainly divergence and diversity has also been shown to drive innovation output as well. So make sure that you've all got devil's advocates on your teams, and that you're able to listen in to people like Lisa Mclean and her team doing some really great work. My final question to you is, so you live in Sydney, as do I. Where should Sydney be looking towards other cities around the world, smart cities, in terms of getting its piece of the puzzle right?
Look, I think Sydney's huge. And so if you're breaking it down into local communities, the councils, as I mentioned, have got a big role to play. And we've got a program at the moment which is benchmarking for councils, starting to measure their circular economy contribution. And we've called it My Circular, because the idea is that it can be made public on those councils' websites so that people can go in and have a look at how much is being recycled and what areas are being recycled. So I think as that program rolls out across Sydney, it's going to be really exciting. I think people will start to get a much better understanding of what those not just what their recycling rates are, but what's that framework? What are the places that they can go to take stuff back to? How can they plug into that? And what's the area that they've, the opportunities that they might be able to leverage? So yeah, benchmarking is really important. Back to my point about you can't make progress unless you measure it. You can't get there unless you set the targets. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for featuring on the Second Renaissance and for your stewardship on these really, really important questions, Lisa.
It was an absolute pleasure, Anders. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Lisa, for switching us from a linear model of thinking to an exponential yet circular mode of thought. Next, we speak with high-octane entrepreneur Creel Price from Investable on how the 3 Ps of planet, people and profit coexist and augment each other, why entrepreneurs have a crucial role to play in fixing the climate crisis, green tech, and what the role of regenerative capitalism is in the economic recovery from the pandemic. For more information about the Second Renaissance and our work on sustainable innovation, please visit my website, www.sorman-nilsson.com. We would appreciate if you can take a moment to share the podcast with a friend or a colleague and help build the movement. We hope that what we learn together on the Second Renaissance can help us all build a sustainable future for ourselves and our children. See you in the near future.